I thought it might be of interest to some people to talk about an aspect of Buddhist practice which you might describe as sort of popular practice. And by popular practice I do not mean that it's of little value or that it's secondary or that it's not, it's a part of the Buddhist tradition without being a part of Buddhist doctrine. I mean that it is a practice that has been done for many centuries and in fact is still widely done. And that is the tradition, the practice of pilgrimage. Probably most people will know that in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is the longest discourse in the Pali Tipitaka, and it relates the last months of the Buddha's life, most people will know that at one point during the Buddha's last journey, he mentioned that somebody who has faith in the Buddha's teachings should, if they get the opportunity, visit the places where the four significant events in his life took place. First of all, Lumbini, where he was born, and Uravella, or as it is known today, Buddhagaya, where he attained enlightenment, and then Isipatana, or as it is now known, Sarnath, where he proclaimed the Dhamma for the first time to his 5 former companions, and Kushinara, where he finally passed away. And he said that if you get the opportunity to visit these 4 places, and should you pass away while you were on this pilgrimage, if you passed away with a serene mind, you would have a good rebirth, you would have an advantageous rebirth. So that's really quite interesting because it indicates that the Buddha saw that there was a place for emotion, particularly positive emotion like devotion, a sense of closeness, emotions that arise because of remembrance of the Buddha, for example. And I think that that's important because when I hear a lot of people talking about meditation, you can get the impression that the perfect Buddhist is like a block of ice. He or she feels nothing. It's just chittas arising and passing away. That is certainly not the impression that you get from many things that the Buddha said. I think it's worth remembering that the Buddha was fully aware that emotion can arouse great energy in individuals. In the case of negative emotions, we know from simply reading the newspapers every now and then that negative emotions have the ability to motivate people to do some very nasty things. But that doesn't mean that emotion itself is the problem, because we also know that emotions can bring out or to energize the best that human beings are capable of. So it is simply not correct to say that the enlightened person or somebody on walking the path should suppress or have no emotional feeling. I don't think that that is correct. The Buddha was a great enough psychologist to understand that emotions can be a very important tool in one's spiritual development. The other thing that comes from this statement by the Buddha is should the pilgrimage with faith, and should they pass away with a serene mind. So the Buddha was not saying that if you're just a pretty ordinary person, you don't take the Dhamma really very seriously, And then a group of friends at the nearby temple are arranging a pilgrimage, and you grumble and you think, well, it's a bit expensive, but at least I'll go. I can take a few nice photos on the way, and you go, and then you pass away, then you're going to have an advantageous rebirth. I don't think that is the case. So first of all, the devout disciple, or the disciple with faith. So that is something that you've probably cultivated over a period of time as a result of studying the Buddha's teachings, meeting with inspiring individuals, inspiring monks, learning some of the suttas, going deeper into the Dhamma, and your faith arises because of that. In other words, you've had faith for quite some time. And secondly, while you're on this pilgrimage, should it happen that you pass away, that if you had a serene mind at that time, then that would be significant in the circumstances in which you were reborn. In other words, the Buddha is reiterating here, as he did many times before, the crucial factor is the state of your mind. I mean, we know in the Dhammapada, the first verse is Mano Pubbangama Dhamma, Mano Setta Mano Maya. The crucial factor is the state of your mind. Not that you happen to have bought a ticket to India, not that you're traveling in a bus on there, the state of your mind at that time. I think the other significant thing about this statement of the Buddha is it might occur to some people that there's a little bit of a downer in his statement. Should you die while you're on your pilgrimage? Well, that's very unlikely to happen today with modern transportation and bridges and good roads in India and decent hotels and what have you. But in ancient times, going on a pilgrimage to the 4 sacred places, this required a great deal of sacrifice and a great deal of difficulty. In those days, travel in India was very difficult. Sometimes you could travel along roads for miles and not find any water available. And in those days, and in India until fairly recently, the possibility of being robbed or attacked by robbers while you're on the road was a fairly good one. In other words, in ancient times, going on a pilgrimage to the 4 places required courage, it required determination, and to some degree, some risk. So it is interesting that the Buddha understood this, and he gave those who read what he had to say the reassurance that if they were a faithful person, if they passed away with a serene mind, then that could have a crucial influence on where they were reborn. What are these 4 places? Well, the first one is Lumbini, which is now in Nepal, and in recent years it has been very beautifully developed, and now you've got various pilgrim rests there. Different Buddhist countries and organizations have constructed temples there. There's a generally fairly good layout and design, but the most important part there is the pillar that King Asoka erected there, marking the fact that it was in this small village, and that's what it's called in his pillar, was the very place where the Buddha was born. I don't think it means that exactly where that pillar was he was born, but close by, somewhere near there. And to do this, of course, Lumbini is just across the border from India, just a few kilometers actually, 20 kilometers maybe. So you can either go to Kathmandu and then take a flight or a bus to Lumbini, or you can come from India, cross the border for a day and visit this very inspiring place. And the second place is Uruvela, which was a small riverside village at the time of the Buddha, and it was on the outskirts of that village, tradition says under a tree, later called the Bodhi tree, that he attained supreme realization, and he had the experience of complete freedom from samsara. And pilgrims have been visiting that place almost since the time of the Buddha himself. And it was the great Emperor Asoka who mentions in one of his edicts that he himself had gone to Sambodhi, which was the name given to Buddha Gaya at that time. I first went to Buddha Gaya back in the early 70s, and I found it very, very inspiring. In those days it was a modestly sized village, not really many facilities there. And since that time it has grown into a large and, I'm sorry to say, rather noisy and cluttered town. This is because in traditional Buddhist countries the possibility of going on pilgrimage is much more able. People are more able to do that today because these countries, Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, are more prosperous, and therefore the desire of people to go there to realize that possibility is much more. So whenever you get a large number of pilgrims or even tourists visiting a place, well, you'll get various advantages. There's good accommodation there now, and various disadvantages. There's all sorts of scam artists and beggars and noise and clutter and what have you, and people trying to separate naive pilgrims from their money. Nonetheless, if you enter the compound around the great temple, and it is one of the great monuments of Indian architecture, then hopefully you will have a moving experience. And even amongst all the clutter and the noise, every time I go there I find walking around the temple, going inside and looking at the beautiful image inside the temple, and going behind the temple to, if possible, spend some time meditating near or even under the Bodhi tree is a very, very uplifting experience. And the third place is Isipatana, the deer park, now called Sarnath. And this is a wonderful place too. The archaeological park around the ruins is fairly well maintained. There's lovely gardens there. There's the Mulaganda Kuti, the foundations of the stupa that was built to mark the place where the Buddha taught the first sermon. There's a pillar by King Asoka, or the stump of the pillar. The pillar had been broken in ancient times. There's also a wonderful museum just outside the archaeological park, which has a magnificent collection of sculpture and other antiquities found when all the temples in Sarnath were excavated. First of all at the beginning of the 20th century and several times since then. It can be a wonderful experience to spend some time just sitting under a tree in the park, observing the other pilgrims coming, meditating, watching the deer, listening to the peacocks. Sometimes there are peacocks wandering through the gardens. It's a very nice and uplifting experience. And the last place of the four is Kusinara, which is also set in a rather beautiful park. And there is a Nirvana temple which was built in the 1950s on the foundation of an earlier temple that was built in ancient times. And there is a very ancient reclining statue of the Buddha depicting him passing away. And directly behind the temple are the remains, now much repaired, of the stupa marking the very place where the Buddha passed away. So that's a very inspiring place too. So if you ever have the opportunity to visit these places, I think it can be good to prepare yourself beforehand by perhaps reading the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, or at least parts of it, because it is a very inspiring discourse, and it contains a great deal of things that are important to anybody who takes the Dhamma seriously. I also recommend, if you ever have the opportunity, um, there are two, I think, really worthwhile books to read before you go on your pilgrimage, and perhaps even to take with you when you go on your pilgrimage. And the first is one, it's called Rude Awakening, and it's by the English monk Ajahn Sucitto and Nick Scott, another Englishman. And they, a decade or so ago, they made a pilgrimage to all these places and some other places on foot, which is quite an achievement. And they had all sorts of experiences, some mostly positive, some negative. It's a highly entertaining book. It's light-hearted and humorous in parts, and yet it imparts in a very readable way the experiences that somebody can have while they're on a pilgrimage, and I highly recommend the book. I also take the opportunity to recommend my book, Middle Land, Middle Way. It's been in print since the 1990s, and I wrote it as a result of going on pilgrimage quite a few times and researching the various places. It is not a narrative story like Rude Awakening, but it is a very detailed account of what you will see on your pilgrimage, how it relates to what we know about ancient India and those places during the Buddhist time. And it also details places that the Buddha did not visit, or at least are not the four main sacred places, and other places in the area which developed the Buddhist culture in the centuries after the Buddha. It's called Middle Land, Middle Way, and you'll find that a useful resource if you ever go on a pilgrimage, which I hope you will, because it can be an uplifting and a very inspiring experience.